Welcome to our deep dive into grit. You know, it's a concept that psychologists and educators and even business leaders are talking about. We've got research articles and books. We even dug up a commencement speech from Jeff Bezos.
Wow.
Yeah. So our mission is to unpack what grit really is and where it comes from and why it matters.
Yeah, what I think is so fascinating about grit is it's not just like this vague idea of toughness. It's like this measurable, researchable quality that's been linked to success in all kinds of fields.
Okay.
So we'll delve into all that from like its surprising origins in a World War II treadmill
A
test.
World War II treadmill test.
Yeah, to how it's being applied in schools and workplaces today.
Okay. A WWII treadmill test. Now you've got my attention.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, let's start with the basics. What exactly is grit?
So many people think grit is just willpower or maybe stubbornness,
Right.
but it's really more nuanced than that. Angela Duckworth, who's like a leading researcher in the field, she defines grit as passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. So it's about having a deep and enduring interest in something and then sticking with it, even when things get tough.
Yeah.
Even when you face setbacks and obstacles and all that.
So it's not just powering through any old task. It's about having a real lasting passion for what you're doing.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But what about natural talent? Doesn't that play a role in success too?
Yeah, talent is definitely important. But here's what's interesting. Research is suggesting that grit can actually outshine talent in the long run. So think of talent as your potential, your natural ability.
Okay.
But grit is what determines whether you actually fulfill that potential.
Got it.
It's what keeps you going when the going gets tough, when other people might give up.
Wow, that's amazing. So are you saying that someone with less natural ability could actually outperform someone more naturally gifted just by being grittier?
Yeah, that's exactly what some of the research suggests.
Right.
Like Duckworth and her colleagues have studied grit in a variety of settings, like from West Point Military Academy to the National Spelling Bee.
Wow, that's quite a range.
Yeah, and what they found is that grit is often a better predictor of success than like IQ or talent.
So how did researchers even start studying grit?
Yeah.
You mentioned a WWII treadmill test. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, it actually starts with this psychologist named Henry Murray.
Okay.
Back in World War II, he was tasked with selecting candidates for dangerous missions behind enemy lines.
Oh, wow.
He needed a way to assess their psychological resilience, their ability to withstand stress and hardship.
So how did a treadmill fit into all of this?
Okay, so Murray developed this thing called the Harvard Psychological Clinic Frustration Test.
Okay.
And one part of this test involved having candidates run on a treadmill until they were totally exhausted.
Oh, wow, that sounds intense. What was he looking for?
He was observing how long they could push themselves, how they responded to physical discomfort and fatigue.
Yeah.
He was looking for individuals who wouldn't give up easily, who had like that mental toughness to persevere, even when their bodies were screaming at them to stop.
That's fascinating. So this WWII treadmill test was one of the earliest attempts to measure something like grit.
Exactly. And while Murray's methods might seem a bit crude by today's standards, they laid the groundwork for future research on resilience and perseverance.
Okay, so we've got this historical context, but what about modern research on grit? What are scientists discovering about how grit works?
One of the most exciting areas of research is looking at the neurological basis of grit.
Oh, okay.
Using brain imaging techniques, scientists are discovering that grit is actually associated with changes in brain structure and function.
Wait, are you telling me that being gritty can actually rewire your brain?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, one study found that people with higher levels of grit, they had increased activity in a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in planning and decision-making and self-control.
Oh, wow. So it's like grit gives you more mental horsepower to stay focused on your goals and resist distractions.
That's a great way to put it. There's also evidence that grit is associated with increased activity in the striatum, which is a part of the brain involved in reward and motivation.
So not only are gritty individuals better at staying focused, they also find the process of pursuing their goals more rewarding.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. But let's be real, not everyone is born with high levels of grit. Is this something we can actually learn or develop?
That is the good news. While some people may have like a genetic predisposition to be grittier, research suggests that grit is a skill that can be cultivated.
Okay.
And we'll explore some of the ways you can do that later on in our deep dive. But first, let's delve into some real-world examples of grit in action. When we think about grit, it's easy to think about like those huge stories.
Right.
You know, the Olympic athletes, the Nobel Prize
The
winners.
big names.
Yeah, but grit isn't just for those people, you know?
Right.
It's something that can benefit anyone in any field.
Right. That's a great point. So let's bring it down to earth a bit. Do you have any examples of everyday people showing grit?
Absolutely. One study that comes to mind looked at grit in salespeople.
Okay.
And the researchers found that grittier salespeople were more likely to stay in their jobs and to make more sales calls,
Okay.
and ultimately to earn higher commissions.
So even in a field that's known for like high turnover and rejection, grit can make a real difference.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that these gritty salespeople weren't necessarily more extroverted or charismatic.
Right.
They simply had that persistence and determination to keep going, even when they faced like rejection or setbacks.
It's pretty inspiring. It's like grit gives you that extra edge to push through those tough moments that might make others give up.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual success either. There's growing evidence that grit can also be a powerful force for like collective achievement.
Okay, now we're talking about collective grit. Earlier you mentioned that grit can be cultivated. How do we actually become grittier?
Well, it's important to remember that grit isn't something you just develop overnight. It's a long-term process, and it requires a combination of internal and external factors.
What do you mean by internal and external factors?
So internal factors are things like your mindset, your beliefs, your values.
Okay.
For example, having a growth mindset is essential for grit.
So instead of saying, I'm just not good at math, you'd say, I can get better at math if I work at it. That kind of thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about positive thinking. It's
Right.
about having strategies for dealing with setbacks, learning from your mistakes, bouncing back from adversity.
That makes sense. What about the external factors? What role does our environment play in developing grit?
Our environment, our culture, the people we surround ourselves with, like our role models, the communities we're a part of, can have a huge impact on our grit.
Right.
Think about a sports team with a culture of hard work and resilience.
Yeah.
Being in that environment can shape your behavior, your mindset, even your identity.
It's like the whole team is working together to develop grit, pushing each other, learning from each other's successes and failures, and creating that sense of determination.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this doesn't just apply to sports teams.
Right.
It can happen in schools, workplaces, even families.
This is blowing my mind a little. So you're saying that we can actually design cultures that foster grit.
The research is suggesting that it's definitely possible.
Wow.
It starts with being really deliberate about the values you emphasize and the norms you establish within that culture.
That's incredibly empowering.
Right.
But let's bring it back to the individual level for a moment.
Yeah.
Earlier, we talked about the importance of deliberate practice. Can you explain what that looks like in practice, pun intended?
Deliberate practice is about going beyond just mindlessly repeating the same thing over and over.
Right.
It's about setting really specific goals for each practice session, focusing on your weaknesses, seeking feedback, and constantly pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone.
Okay.
It can be challenging,
Yeah.
but it's also incredibly rewarding.
Okay, I can see how that would lead to mastery,
Yeah.
but let's face it, staying motivated when things get tough is hard. How can we cultivate that persistence?
That's where passion comes in.
Okay.
When you're truly passionate about something, you're more likely to embrace those challenges and even find joy in the process of getting better.
So it's not just about gritting your teeth and pushing through. It's about finding that deeper sense of purpose and enjoyment.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that passion isn't always something you just stumble upon.
Right.
Sometimes it develops over time as you invest more effort and start to see yourself improving. It's about actively cultivating your interests and seeing where they lead you.
You've provided so many great insights on cultivating grit, but is there ever a downside to grit? I mean, can you have too much of a good thing? Is there such a thing as being too gritty?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes, there can be downsides to grit if it's not balanced with other qualities. For example, if you're so focused on achieving your goals that you neglect your well-being or your relationships or other important aspects of your life, that can be problematic.
So it's not just about pushing yourself relentlessly. It's about finding that sweet spot where you're challenging yourself, but also taking care of yourself.
Exactly. And it's also about being flexible. Sometimes the grittiest thing you can do is to walk away from a goal that's no longer serving you or that's become too costly to pursue.
That's a really important point. Grit isn't about blindly charging ahead. It's about being smart and strategic in your pursuits. It's about knowing when to push forward and when to adjust course.
You got it. And you know, this brings us to a really important point about the future of grit research.
Yeah.
One area that researchers are starting to explore is the idea of wise grit.
Wise grit. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What's that all about?
Wise grit is about combining passion and perseverance with wisdom and flexibility. It's about being able to step back and assess your goals, your strategies, and your impact on others.
So it's like Grit 2.0. It's about taking all that we've learned about grit and refining it, making it even more effective and sustainable.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a concept that I think has huge implications for how we approach education work, even personal development.
I'm so glad you brought that up. We've talked a lot about the individual benefits of grit, but how can this concept be applied on a larger scale in schools or workplaces?
There's growing interest in using grit as a framework for creating more supportive and engaging learning environments.
Okay.
For example, some schools are implementing programs that teach students about growth mindset, deliberate practice, and the importance of pursuing their passions.
So it's not just about telling kids to try harder. It's about giving them the tools and strategies they need to develop their grit.
Exactly, and it's not just about academic success either. Grit can also play a role in helping students develop social-emotional skills like resilience, empathy, and self-awareness.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about workplaces? How can the concept of grit be applied in a professional setting?
Well, some companies are starting to incorporate grit into their hiring processes,
Okay.
looking for candidates who demonstrate passion, perseverance, and a willingness to learn and grow.
So it's not just about skills and experience anymore. It's about finding people who have that inner drive to succeed.
Exactly. And once those employees are on board, companies can foster grit by creating a culture that values hard work, collaboration, and continuous learning.
Okay.
They can provide opportunities for professional development, mentorship, challenging assignments that push employees outside of their comfort zones.
This all sounds incredibly promising. But what about the potential pitfalls? Are there any risks associated with emphasizing grit too much?
That's an important question. One potential risk is that an overemphasis on grit could lead to a culture of overwork and burnout.
So it's about finding that balance between encouraging hard work and promoting well-being.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that grit is not a substitute for addressing systemic inequalities. We need to make sure that everyone has access to the resources and opportunities they need to develop their potential, regardless of their background or circumstances.
That's a really crucial point. Grit is not a magic bullet that can solve all of society's problems, but it can be a powerful tool for creating a more equitable and fulfilling world.
Absolutely. And ultimately, I think that's what makes grit so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual achievement. It's about creating a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like we've gone beyond just defining grit and really explored its complexities and nuances.
I agree. It's been a fascinating deep dive into a topic that has the potential to transform the way we think about success, education, and even the nature of human potential.
Okay, we are back and ready to wrap up our exploration of grit. It's been a journey.
It really has.
Yeah, we covered the science of grit,
Hmm.
the real-world applications, and even talked about, can you have too much grit?
Yeah. Is there a downside to being too gritty?
Yeah, exactly. So what struck me is how grit really challenges our ideas about success. It's not just about talent or intelligence, but about this relentless pursuit of something you really care about.
Right.
This brings me to something I've been thinking about. We talked about the importance of passion. What if you're someone who's struggling to find your passion? What advice would you give?
That's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people struggle with. To be honest, there's no easy answer. But one thing I'd say is passion isn't always this big light bulb moment.
Right.
It's more something that comes from trying new things, exploring, and, discovering what really sparks your interest.
So more about the journey.
Yeah, exactly. And, sometimes passion comes from commitment.
Okay.
You might start doing something just out of curiosity, or maybe even a sense of duty.
Okay.
But then as you put more effort into it and start seeing yourself improve, that's when passion comes in.
So it's like passion can be a byproduct of the grit itself.
Exactly.
You stick with something long enough and you push through those challenges and suddenly you're really invested.
That's the cool thing about it. And I think that shows how grit can be this force for change. It's not just about reaching some goal. It's about developing a mindset to help you embrace challenges, learn from setbacks, ultimately become a better version of yourself.
This has been eye-opening. But before we go, I have one more question for you. If you could give our listeners one piece of advice about grit, what would it be?
Don't underestimate the power of grit. It's something that can be cultivated. And it can make a huge difference in your life, whether you're, trying to achieve a personal goal, pursue your dream job, or even just handle those everyday ups and downs.
Very well said. And remember, grit isn't about being perfect. It's about being persistent. It's about sticking with it, even when it's hard. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into grit.